It was the last day of November 1978. 18-year-old Peter Welch, known as Moochie to his friends, attended a Jackson Browne concert at the Civic Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Welch was taken to the venue by two friends, Richard Trelawney and Nicholas Billingham. But by the time Jackson Browne performed his encore medley, Moochie's companions had apparently left the venue. Authorities believe Welch decided to hitchhike back to his hometown of Libertyville. According to those who knew him, this was a mode of transportation Moochie was comfortable with. After obtaining rides from at least two different vehicles, Welch arrived at the 376 ramp on JFK Drive. The time now was approximately 1:15 a.m., December 1st. From this location, Peter Welch walked a quarter-mile down the road. He had a long way to go to reach his home in the outskirt neighborhood of Kingsfield Pike. With the wind chill factor, the temperature had dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Authorities speculate that instead of walking home, Welch may have been headed to the Happy gas station, only a mile away. Wherever he was headed, he didn't make it. A car was parked at a curb, most likely with its lights off, lying in wait. According to witnesses who looked out the window of the apartment that night, they had been awakened by the sound of screeching tires. Outside, there was no other traffic except that there was a pair of headlights. The vehicle drove straight for Welch, who, according to crime scene forensics, must have jumped out of the way, but not unscathed. It is believed that the bumper of the car took off a small chunk of Moochie's left calf. Next, leaving bloody footprints on the pavement, Welch ran to the doorway of a drive-up photography store. He would have found little safety here, the shop being closed and the door being locked. So he then attempted to flee across JFK Drive, headed for a narrow alley between a mom-and-pop market and a dry cleaning business. Unfortunately, Peter Welch never made it that far. The vehicle hit Moochie again, this time a direct hit from the rear, breaking his spine. It sent him flying into the brick wall of the market. On the pavement, investigators found bloody handprints, as if Moochie was still trying to get to his feet. So at least for a few moments after that initial collision, the young man was still alive. The tire marks reveal that the car pulled into reverse, then floored it, running over the victim, then reversed again, dragging Welch into the middle of the street. More neighbors were awakened by the sound of screams. By the time concerned citizens left their home to investigate, the vehicle and its driver were gone. By then, Welch was a bloodied pulp. This, of course, was more than a hit and run. It was premeditated murder. The vehicle had sped away into the night, and during the day, all the detectives could find were dead ends. Over the next few weeks, authorities conducted many interviews, considered several suspects, but ultimately made no arrests. Disturbingly, Peter Welch was not the only victim of vehicular homicide that year. Several other deaths would follow, but few believed that there were connections. Most assumed that that bloody year was the result of teenage turf wars or drunk driving. And stranger still, as we will discuss, many locals blamed the murder on a phantom car. But it seems that no one, until now, has imagined the possibility that there was a serial killer prowling the streets of Libertyville. A man who would claim at least 7 other lives. A man who would escape justice, thanks in no small part to the superstitions which plagued this case. He is a man that this documentary will finally force out of the shadows and into the light. One of the main reasons the Libertyville deaths of 1978 haven't been considered the work of a serial killer is because some of the murders were meant to look accidental. Case in point, the night of December 12th, 1978. It was a typical Tuesday evening for Buddy Repperton and his friends Richard Trelawney and Robert Stanton. All three of them were students at Libertyville High. It wasn't uncommon for these young men to go joyriding on the outskirts of town. But on this winter's evening, Buddy's Camaro was going over 100 miles per hour down a pitch-dark road over hard-packed snow and ice. He was barreling down the Squantic Hills State Park entrance road. Authorities differ on whether or not they were the only vehicle on the road. Some argued they might have been drag racing, and one detective believed that they might have been chased. But most of the locals and the authorities believed that they were simply joyriding. What we do know as fact is that Buddy's car spun out. The back of his Camaro smashed into the concrete island of the park ranger's gatehouse. The back end of the vehicle crumpled, and in an instant Robert Stanton, a freshman who was new to Buddy's clique, was killed. The Camaro twirled into the air, crashing down and rolling over and over. And when the car burst into flames, it is believed that Richard Trelawney was barely alive, pinned inside the car. He did not live more than a few moments as the fire blazed into his lungs and torched his skin. Buddy Repperton was also in the vehicle, badly injured but still alive. He managed to crawl out and away from the vehicle before it exploded. Paramedics would find his severed ear near the burnt-out Camaro. With a broken leg and shattered ribs, Repperton still somehow was able to crawl up a 6-foot snowbank. Coroners believed he died a few minutes after the wreck. A shard from his broken ribs pierced his aorta. The newspaper headline read, "3 killed in car crash at Squantic Hills State Park," and an unnamed police source was quoted saying, "Liquor probably was a factor." Lieutenant Rudolph Junkins was the detective assigned to the Welch case, and when Buddy Repperton and his passengers perished on that lonely road, the lieutenant became one of the only people to see the disturbing connections. Peter Welch was not only friends with Richard Trelawney, but also Buddy Repperton. Buddy was the de facto leader of their group, and by all accounts, Mr. Repperton was a bully and a wannabe hoodlum. In addition to being associated with Moochie and Richie, Buddy was also friends with Donald Vanderberg and Sandy Galton. Vanderberg's father owned the gas station, the one that Welch had been walking towards, and the establishment often served as a meetup point for Buddy and his friends. But on Christmas Eve that year, with most of Don's friends dead and a snowstorm battering all of Pennsylvania, young Mr. Vanderberg must have felt dreadfully alone as he sat on duty, not a customer in sight, waiting for midnight when he could close the station and head for home. But Don Vanderberg did not make it until the stroke of midnight, and he did not lock up the gas station or clock out early. Sometime after 10 p.m., for reasons we can only guess, Vanderberg abandoned his post and climbed over a snowbank, entering JFK Drive. He was found dead in the street early Christmas morning. The coroners believed he slipped onto an icy patch and was then run over by an unknown car, another hit and run. And this was not Libertyville's only Christmas Eve homicide that year. The next death also involved an automobile, but it didn't take place on the streets. It happened at the home of William Darnell, the owner of a do-it-yourself garage. There were other business endeavors, many of which may have been illegal, but we'll return to Darnell's career later. On December 24th, before midnight, Darnell was simply a middle-aged, overweight, asthmatic chain smoker, sitting in his second-story house watching television. Then, outside on the street of Liberty Heights, a car horn blared. residents peeked outside windows to see a red Plymouth at the end of Darnell's driveway, blocked by a snowbank, which acted as an accidental barricade. The Plymouth backed up and smashed into the snowbank several times until it finally breached the barricade, careened down the driveway, and crashed through the picture window of the living room. Eyewitness accounts are sketchy from this point, but it is generally agreed that the automobile reversed and smashed straight through the house at least 2 more times. The entire sidewall caved in. Crime scene investigators would later find skid marks throughout the demolished living room, the carpet in tatters. Darnell's body was discovered at the bottom of the stairs, a crumpled mess of rearranged flesh and shattered bones. But even before the Plymouth had accomplished its bloody mission, Darnell had already died of a massive heart attack, probably from the sudden terror of the situation. In the moments before Darnell's untimely demise, his phone records indicate that he made 2 calls. One was to the operator in an attempt to call the police, but before that, he had tried a different number. He had tried to contact the home of his employee, a young man named Arnie Cunningham. The call went unanswered. But why make the call anyway? Why would William Darnell try to contact his assistant garage attendant while a Plymouth is rampaging down his driveway? That's precisely what Detective Junkins wondered. You see, as early as the first murder, Arnie Cunningham, Arnie to his friends, had been a person of interest, and with good reason. Arnie owned a 1958 autumn red Plymouth Fury. He had purchased it as an old junker earlier that year and spent months restoring it, some might say resurrecting it, to its former glory. According to some of the do-it-yourselfers at Darnell's garage who witnessed the progress, Arnie restored the car with remarkable speed. They said he loved that car. He had purchased it from a Korean War veteran named Roland Lebay. The Plymouth was in dismal condition, rusted bumpers, shattered windows. It was barely running, and he decided to keep the nickname which Lebay had originally given it years ago. The car's name was Christine. So Arnie Cunningham had a vehicle that fit the description of the Welch hit and run. More than this, Cunningham had motivation. Arnie knew Buddy Repperton from school, and also he knew him from Darnell's garage. Buddy had been working there when Arnold first came in to use the services. One day in early September of that year, Repperton and Cunningham got into a physical altercation that ended with Arnold receiving a black eye and Buddy ultimately getting fired. Impressed by the scrawny young man's spunk, Darnell gave Cunningham a job soon after. By the end of the month, tension between the 2 rivals escalated. A fight broke out on school grounds near the designated smoking area. A crowd of students gathered to watch Repperton and Cunningham circle each other, Arnie with only his fists and Buddy with a switchblade knife. And Repperton wasn't alone. Don Vanderberg and Moochie Welch were there, making the fight even more unfair. Fortunately, the auto shop teacher, Mr. Casey, intervened before anyone could get hurt. The principal expelled Repperton for bringing a deadly weapon to school. Unsurprisingly, Buddy vowed revenge, and on November 14th, he would make that promise come true. Before that fateful night, things had been going well for Arnie Cunningham. Buddy wasn't around school or work, so Cunningham devoted his time to his new occupation at Darnell's and enjoyed driving his newly revitalized car around town with his new girlfriend, Lee Cabot. But things weren't all smooth sailing. Cunningham's parents didn't want the car parked in front of their house. In fact, according to a comment in Junkins' police report, Michael and Regina Cunningham were initially against Arnie buying the car in the first place. Since parking at Darnell's was $20 a month, which was actually quite expensive for the time, Arnie resorted to a parking lot across town next to the airport. And one of the parking lot attendants was Sander Galton, Sandy to his friends, and a known associate of Buddy Repperton. On the evening of the 14th, when Galton was the only attendant on duty, he surreptitiously allowed Repperton, Welch, Vanderburg, and Trelawney onto the property. Next, while Galton remained in his booth, keeping lookout, Repperton and his cohorts went to work, demolishing Arnold Cunningham's prized possession, Christine. The next day, a security guard made note of the vandalism in a report. The front bumper had been pried halfway off, most of the windows had been shattered, holes had been punched into the chrome, many of the dashboard instruments had been wrenched from their compartments, and one of the vandals left a pile of human excrement as a calling card. Arnold must have been enraged. 2 weeks later, on November 30th, Peter Moochie Welch was run down in the street. And as mentioned, the witnesses identified an older model of a car, the color red. Therefore, Cunningham seems like the obvious suspect, and Detective Junkins must have thought so as well, because he questioned both Arnold and his father on several occasions. Clearly, the lieutenant had his suspicions, but when he inspected the Plymouth Fury, which had already been remarkably repaired by early December, Junkins determined that it could not have been the same vehicle that mowed down the Welch boy. There was no signs of damage or chipped paint, no scratches, no dents. Welch had been thoroughly and repeatedly run over, so it stood to reason that there would be telltale signs of collision, and yet, in his report, the car was immaculate, which is all the more curious considering the supposed vandalism from 2 weeks prior. Also, Cunningham had an alibi, albeit a dubious one. His father stated that Arnold had been home the night of the murder, asleep in his bed. But perhaps Detective Junkins should have looked closer, not just at Cunningham as a suspect, but the entire operation at Darnell's do-it-yourself garage. Junkins should have trusted his suspicions and investigated further before it was too late. But he might have simply assumed that Arnie was a typical high school nerd, good at academics, awkward around girls, the last person one would expect to commit a crime. You see, by all accounts, Arnold grew up on the right side of the tracks, so to speak. Both of his parents taught at Horlicks University, his father history, his mother English. And early on they established the importance of academic rigor. Arnold had tutors, took extra courses, even classes during the summer, and chess club. It led to a childhood that was low on friends, except for one neighborhood boy named Dennis Gilder, who would stick with Arnold from Owens Andrew Grammar School through Darby Junior High, and even throughout their high school years. By then, Dennis was a popular member of the football team, and when he could, Dennis tried to use his influence to prevent bullies from picking on Arnold. But he couldn't be there all of the time, and Arnie attracted all sorts of abuse from the denizens of Libertyville High. 5'10" and only 140 pounds, low on muscle, even lower on athletic skill, Arnold was a bully magnet, and on top of all of that, his face was riddled with acne for most of his high school life. Therefore, it is easy to imagine Arnold Cunningham reaching a breaking point, crossing a moral line. So when Darnell fired Repperton and hired Arnie at the garage, the young man, perhaps unknowingly at first, entered a seedy underbelly. Here, Arnold was respected. Darnell gave him more and more responsibilities. Co-workers like Jimmy Sykes looked up to Arnie. The mechanics at the garage and the students in auto shop all must have admired Arnie's skill and speed as he continually restored the Plymouth Fury. As we mentioned, Darnell had many connections, some of which involved organized crime. Darnell's operation involved smuggling contraband across state lines. Sometimes it was relatively benign, like cigarettes or fireworks, and sometimes it was narcotics. When Darnell asked if Arnie wanted to become part of this illegal operation, Cunningham said yes. Soon after, Arnie found himself with a lot of spending cash. This was about the same time that his acne started clearing up. He became more popular at school. He won the heart of Lee Cabot. and he also stopped turning in homework, much to the chagrin of his parents. It must have been a fun ride while it lasted, but it did not last. Just 4 days after the deaths of Buddy Repperton and his friends, Arnie was arrested crossing the border with cigarettes, hidden in a secret compartment in Darnell's vehicle. So, given his criminal behavior and motivation, it's easy to see why Junkins continued to suspect Cunningham. And yet, in the case of the Repperton crash, as well as the Christmas Eve murders of Will Darnell and Don Vanderberg, Arnold Cunningham had an airtight alibi. On December 12th, he was out of town, competing in a chess tournament. Multiple witnesses, including a teacher, confirmed that they were with Arnold all weekend. Likewise, Arnold was with his parents and extended family on Christmas Eve in a town 90 miles away from Libertyville. Detective Junkins, according to his notes, still believed that Cunningham was involved in some way, even if the disgruntled teenager hadn't been the one behind the wheel. By this time, FBI forensics had concluded that flakes of automobile paint on the broken gate in the state park matched the same flakes of paint found embedded into the body of Peter Welch. The color was called autumn red, the exact same shade found on the Plymouth Fury owned by Cunningham. But Detective Junkins never had the chance to put all of the clues together. On January 4th, perhaps on the verge of cracking the case, Junkins was driving down a country road towards Blairsville, Pennsylvania, a charming borough 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh. We don't know why he was driving out to this location, if he was planning to meet someone, but we do know that Detective Rudolph Junkins, Rudy to his friends, encountered another vehicle. The skid marks near the crash site indicate that he was driven off the country road. Junkins' car plummeted down a steep embankment, rendering his car a mangled wreck, and Junkins, sadly, was an equally mangled corpse. There were now 7 unsolved homicides, a long and bloody list, and it didn't stop there. On January 19th, Arnold Cunningham and his mother Regina took a road trip. By now, Arnold Cunningham, out on bail, had appealed to his parents, promising to get back onto the straight and narrow. On that Friday afternoon, Arnold left Libertyville High School and got into his mother's Volvo. They were going on a trip to Penn State in order to tour the campus. While driving on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, the Volvo swerved into oncoming traffic, colliding with a semi. Moments after the wreck, the Volvo, known for being one of the safest automobiles on the road, exploded into flames. Both Arnold and Regina perished, making this at first glance seem like an accident. Yet the truck driver involved offered a very disturbing eyewitness testimony. He said that he saw 3 people in the car, and that it seemed like more than one person was struggling to take over the steering wheel. Police Inspector Richard Mercer speculated that it was possible a hitchhiker or some other unidentified individual could have been in the car, survived the accident, and then left the scene. Or perhaps the truck driver, who walked away from the wreck with only a broken arm, was simply mistaken.
Now, the rest of the story.
Famed radio broadcaster Paul Harvey discussed the death of Arnold and Regina not because of the possible connections to Darnell and Junkins, but because of a bizarre coincidence. Harvey explained, in that signature style of his, that around the same time that Arnie and his mother met their fate, the dad of the family, Michael Cunningham, died in a freak accident, slipping on ice in the driveway of the family home. The bright side of the tragedy, at least according to Paul Harvey, was that the entire family must have entered the pearly gates of heaven together.
And now you know the rest of the story.
But do we? For a short time, the press marveled over the sad serendipity of Michael's simultaneous and supposedly unrelated demise. However, the initial police report, which never made it into the newspapers, stated that Michael Cunningham had died of carbon monoxide poisoning, most likely while sitting inside the Plymouth Fury. And while the car had been parked at the Cunningham residence that morning, That is not where Michael's body or the Plymouth were discovered. Instead, the body of Michael Cunningham was found strewn across the floor in the shambles of Will Darnell's office in the now infamous do-it-yourself garage. The Plymouth, Arnold's pride and joy, was also there, a complete wreck, thanks to the indoor demolition derby conducted by Arnold's two friends, Lee Cabot and Dennis Gilder. Why were they in the garage? And how and why did they destroy the car? We'll untangle that mess in a moment, but first, let's consider the possibility that all of these deaths are, in fact, linked, that a serial killer has masterminded each vehicular homicide. Who have we not considered as a suspect yet? Well, if you've been paying attention, then you may have realized that Sander Galton is the last survivor among Repperton's cronies. Shortly after the Welch murder, Galton left town. He didn't even tell his own mother where he was going. There's no real evidence to pin this on Galton. It's more likely that Galton left Libertyville behind because he was scared. And if so, it seems his instincts were correct. Because in 1982, 4 years after these macabre events, Galton was working a late shift at a drive-in movie theater in Los Angeles County. All of the other employees had gone home, and Galton was in the process of locking up. That's when the automobile smashed through the wall of the snack bar. The vehicle barreled through the concessions counter and pinned Galton against the door of the projectionist booth. He was found dead at the scene. The vehicle and its driver were not, but forensics found flakes of paint on the crime scene, the color of autumn red. The years and the distance kept authorities from connecting the dots, but looking at these events decades later, it is clear that Galton's death was part of a plan, and that running away from Libertyville only delayed the inevitable. But let's go back to January 19th, 1979. The police told the press that Michael Cunningham died in a freak accident and was discovered at his residence. So why did the police initially cover up Michael Cunningham's death? And why weren't Cabot and Gilder charged with any crimes? If not murder, at least trespassing and destruction of property. After all, they had rented a septic tank truck, colored pink by the way, and drove it into Darnell's garage, where they proceeded to demolish the Plymouth Fury. Why? And did they move the body? Were they perhaps responsible for Cunningham's death? Inspector Mercer didn't believe so. He would eventually tell his colleagues that he believed that the two kids thought they were destroying a vehicle that had been cursed. That's right. Lee and Dennis believed that Christine was possessed by an evil spirit, and Cabot and Gilder's superstitious paranoia must have been contagious because over the years, many residents of Libertyville and beyond have come to believe that a haunted Plymouth still prowls these streets with a specter behind the wheel.
It's a ghost car!
But when superstition is taken too far, it becomes no laughing matter and can actually obstruct the quest for justice. Therefore, in part 2 of our deep dive into the mysteries of Libertyville, we'll be exploring the legend behind the so-called ghost car to determine fact from fiction, and we'll learn the disturbing truth about the man who first owned the vehicle as we inch ever closer into the inner circle of a beloved car known as Christine. In the meantime, we'd like to thank each and every one of you who have helped this channel grow over the years, and offer a special note of appreciation to those of you who have become members at the Constant Watcher and #1 fan levels. As always, thanks for watching and listening to the Stephen King Book Club. Drive safe, everybody.